Hey, welcome back to another episode of the RUCKCast. My name's Jim Palmer. Thank you for joining us. Me, somebody. Joining us is in the greater us. How about that? Um, this episode, I want to finish out the top 10. If you watched the last episode, I got the number, we got number 9 done. This has been a long time in the making, so I'm really excited to get this done, get this wrapped up, because it really felt like this is sort of like a personal mission to me to try to get everything sort of tied together and have something that I can point people to and say, hey, you know what, you want to really know what we want you to know about Wi-Fi, or the things we really wish you'd know or realize. I wanted to have some place that I could point people to. So this is going to be the final episode of that. So without further ado, let's get into the 10 things that you need to know about Wi-Fi, or at least the 10 things that we came up with here at the RUCKCast. So here is a recap. We're now on number 10. So we're going to run through this real quick. Number 1, the client's always in charge. Number 2, more is not always better. 3, what are the requirements? 4, it all starts with a good design. 5, default isn't always best. Although there should be a little asterisk next to that says, yeah, but sometimes it is. And knowing which one's to change and which one's not to change is really the mark of a true professional. Trust but verify. That's another good one. Security is great until the client doesn't support it. So then you have to know how you work around that. It's not always about the speed. And Wi-Fi is intended to work poorly. That was our last episode. So this one, the last one, number 10 here. Expert is a loaded word. This is one that I usually get to first, because there's a lot of times people will call me an expert. They'll say, oh, Jim, you're an expert on this, you're an expert on that. And I always come up with expert is a loaded word, because people who know, they actually know. They know that they're not an expert. The more you know you don't know. And that's what that know part is, right? People who first learn, you get really excited and you go, yeah, I'm learning stuff. I'm learning all this fantastic stuff about Wi-Fi, about radios, about RF, about antennas, about how all this sort of magic stuff works. And so you start going, and when you look at other people, you say, oh man, that person's an expert. And the people that admit that they're experts generally don't know. But the people who know, they know they aren't an expert. I like to tell a story. I've known 2, maybe 2.5 people in my career that I looked at and I said, man, that person is an expert. Like I would look at them and it's just like, they are an expert. And they never met each other. They worked in 2 different cities for 2 different companies. And I met them at 2 wildly different times in my career. But I asked them the same question. And I said, would you call yourself an expert? And both of them gave almost the identical answer, word for word. And that was, I'm not. No, don't call me an expert. They said, because once you learn enough about RF, once you learn enough about how things, end up working in the wild, they're like, the more you realize that it just surprises you every single time, every single day, there's something that happens and you go, wow, I didn't expect that. You go, I understand it. I understand why it's doing that, but I did not expect that to happen. And so people who know will generally say, I know a lot, but I still have so much more to learn. So that's the first thing about, expert being a loaded word. The next one I want to talk about is the Dunning-Kruger effect, because this is in full effect here when you talk about it. It's funny because I always thought the Dunning-Kruger effect was something that was very well known, that it was very much of something that, everybody knew what the Dunning-Kruger effect was. And I'm finding out that, well, it turns out people don't. So I want to take a second and we want to talk about the Dunning-Kruger effect. Dunning and Kruger were 2 doctoral candidates who decades ago came up with this, they were doing some research and they came up with these findings. And these findings are generally represented nowadays. And I learned, I actually read something the other day, a couple weeks ago actually, and I didn't realize it because they were talking about the study. And it wasn't until I got to the end and I saw the graph, I went, wait a second, I know this graph. And I went back and I read who the researchers were who this was named after. And it turns out it was Dunning and Kruger. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. But here's the Dunning-Kruger effect graph. And I love this one. And it's simply because of the second point in here, that big tall peak of Mount Stupid. I am guilty of this just like anybody else. I have climbed the peak of Mount Stupid. I have a reserved spot on the peak of Mount Stupid, because I will tell you that time and time again, as I go through life, as I go through my career, I continually climb the peak of Mount Stupid, and I plant my flag there very confidently, and I say, this is what's going on because I learned this and I know everything. And then all of a sudden you realize it's totally wrong. So the way you read this graph is, sort of your confidence level is in the y-axis, that vertical axis, and time is on the x-axis, the horizontal one. And so when you first start learning about something, you really know nothing. And so as you learn about this thing, and all of a sudden you realize, man, I know more about this than anybody I know now. You just, your knowledge level just spikes super fast as you learn about it, because you're just learning, and everything you learn is just super brand new. And you climb up to the peak of Mount Stupid and you start running around saying, it's like, I know everything. I learned all this cool stuff. I'm an expert at it now. And in reality, you're just at the peak of Mount Stupid. And generally what happens is something comes along and it breaks your confidence. It breaks you as a person, as a human. It just breaks you all the way down, and you fall into the valley of despair. And people who tell you, and people who've done this a long time, will say, yeah, I generally go from the peak of Mount Stupid down into the valley of despair. And sometimes I get up out of there every once in a while, but man, it just feels like you just get stuck down in this trough. And that's where you sort of live. But over time, as you start to learn more, as you start to kind of progress, and that's that experience and time along that x-axis really starts to get you to that slope of enlightenment, and finally the plateau of sustainability. Now, I like to tell people, especially my family and friends who ask me about this stuff, I go, one of the ways that I can escape out of the valley of despair and I can get up onto the slope of enlightenment and, that expert level where it's really just a plateau of sustainability is I've given up. I'm trying, as soon as I gave up not being an expert, I said, you know what? I don't want to be an expert. I don't want, that's not my goal. My goal is just to learn. As soon as you give up trying to control, as you give up trying to be that know-it-all person, that's when all of a sudden you just sort of, you're able to learn better. You're able to learn more. You're able to sort of accept the fact that you're going to get knocked down in the valley of despair. And it's no longer despair anymore. You just go, I'm just further down the slope. I just have more to learn. And so that's sort of how that works. So this is the Dunning-Kruger effect. And what I will tell you is, like I said earlier, we all climb to the peak of Mount Stupid. Even those of us that have been doing it for 30 plus years, or you've been doing it for 30 plus days, we have all done it. We've all gotten there. I did a podcast, somebody else's podcast a year ago. And they sort of asked me at the end of our 3-hour conversation, they said, well, what's your advice to people who are just learning about all this stuff? And it was specifically around radios. And I told them, I said, here's the thing. Realize that you're joining a club, a really, really large club of millions, tens of millions of people around the world who are learning about this every single day. You're constantly learning. So when you have those setbacks, when you get knocked down, the experts are the ones that don't, sort of dwell on that. Experts are the ones who have given up and said, yeah, I'm going to make mistakes all the time. And you know what? That's fine, because that's how I learn. And I'm okay learning. That's why you'll see experts asking all the questions, is because they don't care if people think they're silly. They don't care about that stuff, because they've been to the peak of Mount Stupid, and they've been in the valley of despair so many times. They're just like, screw it. I don't care anymore. I'm just going to go do me, and I'm going to do my thing. And that's when you really start to kind of get up there on that slope. So if you haven't seen this before, you're welcome. You can now go tell everybody else about the Dunning-Kruger effect and the peak of Mount Stupid. And but just know that this is sort of that expert being a loaded word, is because we all go through this. that's why it's so famous amongst a lot of people about this Dunning-Kruger effect, is because it has so much truth to it. And so how do you learn? How do you get up on that peak? How do you get off the peak, and how do you get up on that plateau, or as you start to climb out of it? And we learn by doing. We learn by making those mistakes. Just earlier today, I was talking to somebody and I said, I used to be a trainer. And I would tell people, I'm like, I can train you, not because I'm smart, but because I've made the same mistakes 4 times. The first 3 times I didn't learn. And finally, by that 4th time, it finally got drilled into my head that, hey, maybe that's a bad idea and I shouldn't do that. Let's figure out a different way. And so you just keep doing it. It's repetition. You just do it, and do it. But the key is to understand that when you learn by doing, you're going to have some problems. You're going to have times in your learning where what you end up doing is a dumpster fire, floating down a flooded street. There's just no other ways around it. This is how you learn. And everybody does it. So don't get discouraged. Don't despair. Don't get stuck in the valley of despair. Just know that you're going to light some things on fire. I used to say if I didn't light things on fire once a week, I wasn't really doing my job. And that was actual literal fire, by the way. If you've ever been leaning over a giant power supply that powers, hundreds of watts of radio, and you turn it on and a flame shoots out and hits you in the chest, that's the type of fire I'm talking about. So I've been there. I've done that. I've fried some stuff. I've literally had fires. So it happens. It happens to all of us. Because every once in a while, you get past the fire and you get to do the victory dance. Because you've all done it. You get that little LED to blink, or that ping response, or, all of a sudden you just get authenticated. And you get an IP address. You're like, this is amazing. And all your friends and family look at you and go, what? What is wrong with you? Is that really what you're so excited about? And you go, yeah, and you do your little victory dance like this guy, like my buddy here, and you just go, yeah, I'm doing my victory dance. Because just like in the Dunning-Kruger effect, where I was talking about, you go up on the peak and then you're down in the valley, and you go through this cycle, just like a sine wave. It's just a cycle. You're going to have these dumpster fires, and then you're going to have my dancing guy over there. It just happens. This is how you become an expert, is because you end up riding enough flaming dumpsters down enough flooded streets that all of a sudden you go, hey, you know what? I know how to fix that, not because I'm smart, but because I've been in that dumpster over here more than once. And I've had my bacon cooked by that fire one too many times. And so that's where the experts really come from. So, we learn by doing. And if you haven't figured it out yet, you will make mistakes. And that's fine. That's fine. That's how we learn. I've seen 2 or 3 different presenters who've made comments about they go back and they reevaluate their work from years previously. Even when they refresh up networks that they designed originally, and they go back to it and they look at it and they go, oh my goodness, what was I thinking? And you're just like, I can't believe they paid me to do that. Like, what was I thinking? Man, I was just on the peak of Mount Stupid. And so you will make mistakes. But by making those mistakes and keeping your head up, you will get better. And so while you might not ever get to the point where you become the expert that you think everybody else is, or you're going to find that there's going to get people that will all of a sudden look at you and say, you know what? They are the expert. Because I made a comment at a conference one time, and I said, you might not be an expert in the room, but when you leave this conference and when you go other places, you become the expert in that room. You're the one who knows more of this stuff than anybody else. You might not be at the level you want to be. You might not be at the level of some of the big names that are, the usual suspects that you always see and hear talking about Wi-Fi. And some of the guests we've had here at the RUCKCast, you might not ever be at that level, but you keep trying, you keep working, and eventually you're going to be at the level where not just the people in your company or the people around you, but other people start recognizing you and realizing that, hey, you know what, this person really knows what they're talking about. And so if you ever see somebody who claims that they're an expert at Wi-Fi, yeah, that's one of those red flags that I always come back to, and I go, man, if you're going to claim you're an expert, like that tells me that you still have a little bit to go, which is fine because they're still in that cycle. So just keep that, in mind, keep that with a grain of salt. But those are the top 10 things that I, want you to know. I want you to think about as you go through your life with Wi-Fi, with, whether you're in this for, a couple of years, a couple of months, because you just happen to be the person that drew the short straw, if you will, or you have people that said, you know what, like me, who said, man, I really like this Wi-Fi thing. I'm going to keep doing it on purpose. And so that's it. If you have any thoughts on any of my top 10 things, if you have any discussions, let me know. I'd love to hear what you guys think about these top 10 things that, we think you should know about Wi-Fi. So thanks for joining me. Thanks for sticking around for over a year to get through all 10. And I really hope you go back through if you've forgotten what the first conversations were on those first 8. I really hope you go back and watch those again and kind of get up to speed, because there's a lot of good information. And I know a lot of people that could really, use that. So thanks for joining me. And I'll see you next time on another episode of the RUCKCast. Hey there, thanks for listening. If you like the show and haven't done so, please like and subscribe. If you want to contact the show directly, you can email us at ruckcast@comscope.com. I do read those emails. To learn more about any Ruckus products or services that we've talked about on this or any other prior podcast, please check out our About section of the show or the show notes. And as always, thank you for listening.